Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome back to Brexit Watch the former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, John Anderson. John, great to have you back with us.
Good to be with you again. Sorry, I got a frog in my throat. It's not COVID-19.
I'm sure it isn't. Good to see you after all these months. We spoke last in May, so it's good to touch base with you again in mid-October. John, when we last spoke, coronavirus was sort of, it seemed to have kind of, Australia seemed at that moment to be over the worst of it in many ways, or at least had got a handle on it. And it was Britain and Europe that was really getting to grips with it. I remember our conversation. It seems as though Australia is still suffering. We hear in the UK of quite draconian measures still there. The UK and Europe is now going through apparently a second wave. More measures are coming in here, more restrictions coming in here. John, what do you think is happening? What's your assessment, both in Australia and globally, of where we are?
Look, I have to say that I'm far sanguine on any. I'm now really very, very deeply concerned. This is what I think you're seeing as a further acceleration of history. We know now that China, via pretty tough measures, the sort you couldn't, I guess, impose on the West, appears to have beaten its problem and it's back on its path for a strong economic growth, whereas the rest of us are really damaging our economies. And I'm, as something of an Anglophile, I really do love the old Dart very dearly. I'm deeply concerned about the explosion of public sector debt and the implications for your economy, coupled with what looks to be a real mess around Brexit and trade opportunities, sort of mired in trouble. Here in Australia, it's very important to remember that, like America, we're a federation. Now, the current Prime Minister has managed far better than the President of the United States, I think it's fair to say, to coordinate the federation. But the problem that you allude to is essentially one of Victoria and Melbourne in particular, where a very woke government extraordinarily put in place some very sloppy arrangements, and they're proving very good at avoiding real scrutiny of what happened in managing quarantine for returning passengers and what have you. Essentially, they put a bunch of people in charge who've got training in diversity, but not in how to use PEP and so on and so forth. So you had a cluster, and then is it a second wave or is it a spike in the first wave? I fear it's the latter. What we're seeing is a respiking of the first wave, which begs the question, will there be a second? And by contrast, in Australia, we've got a very interesting case study. The biggest state, New South Wales, 40% of the people, 40% of the economy, has been managed by a more centre-right government, which has tried very hard to think sensibly about a balance between the economy, keeping people in work, and really up-to-date, but surprisingly non-intrusive tracking and monitoring. And it seems to have worked. Our biggest state has, if you like, kept the doors of the economy open. There are reasonable freedoms for people to meet. When a cluster emerges, they seem to be onto it very, very quickly. They're very effective at tracing people, finding them, and dealing with the situation. So we've got a very, very mixed bag in Australia. We're a study of the way to handle it and the way not to handle it. Now, I'm really concerned to hear that you're moving back to, I think you call it Tier 2 in London. And I just, I feel so deeply for Britain at the moment, a country that's shown the way on consensual, sensible, tolerant debate, finding a way through, allowing people to question, answering those questions, all the sort of classic models of liberal behaviour and liberal interaction. And now you're mired in this lot. And I'm struck too by the loss of authority. It seems to me, as an Australian looking on, a former politician, of your Prime Minister. He won a thumping majority not so long ago. That's been dissipated. And with that comes frustration, people less and less willing to cooperate with tough measures. And I think the dawning realization that the social and the financial costs of this thing are just ballooning before our eyes. Sorry, long-winded answer.
Not at all. You mentioned the cost of it. I note that recent economic data from the IMF and elsewhere seems to indicate that while much of the world is, well, almost the entire world is suffering economically, China, a country you've spoken about before, is doing pretty well according to the official data. We also know at the moment that there are conflicts emerging around the world. It's quite widely reported here a growing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But I think perhaps more alarming is a growing border dispute between India and China. And one gets the impression perhaps that India is very aggrieved that a virus which has emanated from China has set India back so far, and the data would seem to indicate that, while in a sense, if not benefiting China, certainly not harming China anything like to the degree that it's harming other countries. What's your assessment of the geopolitical situation now compared to when we last spoke?
Well, I think it's a further exploration of history, and I think I might have used that term then. You're seeing a whole series of unfortunate trend lines being accelerated. And I think back to Lee Kuan Yew, who way back in about 2001, 2002, a very astute statesman, of course, from Singapore, who observed that in the case of China, the flexing of economic muscle will be about all they've got to do to bring individual nations to heel if they choose to go down that road. Therefore, the only answer is for people to club together and act in concert, attack one of us, you attack all of us. What I think I would draw out of that is an urgent need for a really concerted effort to return as quickly as possible to a rules-based system of, sort of a liberal global order, and to have as many nations as possible recommit to that model. But as you allude to, you've got trouble spots everywhere. It's all very well to focus on China, but you've got Iran, you've got, Soviet problems in the old Soviet bloc, you've got North Korea, any number of trouble blocks. And for those of us who are, really committed to the idea of trying to find a peaceful way forward and an economic recovery, we need unity, not disunity. Now, the problem is that, as historians will say, you often get social unrest with pandemics. So you see things like Black Lives Matter, where what's bubbling to the surface now is the outcoming, if you like, the sort of result of critical theory, if I can put it that way, this idea that the West is a terrible force for bad, that we've done nothing good, that we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, and that our problem in essence is white supremacy. So we're being attacked from within and from without at a time when more than ever we need international unity. And of course, we spoke last time about the high desirability of a greater degree of cooperation between Canada, America, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, CANZAC. The sooner the better. And yet, I can imagine it's very hard for you Brits at the moment to focus outwardly at a time when you've got such serious internal issues. So, look, it is deeply troubling. And I'm very thankful that I think we're well led in Australia. I think our Prime Minister has been sensible and pragmatic and has taken the people with him. But that is very rare. We are desperately short of leaders who are able to pull people in their own culture together and then inspire and lead others around the world to tackle the problems that we confront in a unified way, which has been the model that seems to have been so rejected in recent times. So, I mean, I can't be anything other than very deeply concerned.
No, we share that concern, John. You mentioned CANZAC, and I'd like to touch on CANZAC and Brexit in a moment, but you also mentioned Black Lives Matter, which makes me think of the US. Obviously, a couple of weeks from now, we are going to see an election there. It's often said that these elections are the most important of a lifetime. This one may well be. That might not just be hyperbole on this occasion. based on what's happening in the world, what do you think the implications are of the US election? And do you have any forecast of what may happen?
I don't. I think at the moment, you've only got to look at the places where Trump is travelling to and the energy he's putting into it. He knows and his team knows they're in deep trouble. And at the moment, you'd have to say, in the normal course of events, there'll be a change of president. Either way, I have to say, I see a deeply divided America continuing to polarize. I hope I'm wrong, for not just for America. I do feel very strongly that this extraordinary contempt that's entered public life, whereby, as Arthur Brooks, I think, puts it, the American author, you combine anger and disgust and you get contempt. And when you get contempt, it's almost impossible to sit down and have a rational discussion between two peoples or groupings of peoples who are contemptuous of one another. That is an extraordinary place for America to have reached. Now, America's always been a fermenting society. It was born in ferment. It went through perhaps one of the ugliest civil wars of all history, in which 600,000 people in a small country died and families were set against family. But what we're seeing now is the emergence of a whole new dynamic. And I can't see very much to commend it because of the way in which the common practice now is to demonize, to deny the very humanity of those that you disagree with. That is the antithesis of the liberal model, where people of left of the centre and right of the centre could agree on some basics, including respect for one another, sufficient to enable effective dialogue and the finding of consensus on the way forward. At a time when we need that ability to communicate more than ever and to explore our shared concerns and find shared answers based on what I hope is our deep desire to maintain military peace, let's be blunt about this, and to start to recover our economies for the sake of the next generations, the very time when we need that more than ever, it's in scarcer supply than ever.
We've spoken about CANZUK before. You're obviously in Australia and I'm in the UK, and we've touched on this subject. I've written about it at length. My sense is that the US is in the state that you're describing. It's increasingly unwilling, perhaps understandably less willing to leave the Western alliance as it once did. The EU can't form a coherent bloc. It's why people like myself have supported Brexit. We don't believe the EU can cohere geopolitically. We're actually seeing a manifestation of that right now in the East Mediterranean. For me, John, CANZUK is an imperative. I see it now as something that really Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom need to do. It's not just about economics. It's about military interoperability opportunities as well. I think CANZUK's had a bit of a shot in the arm with the election of Erin O'Toole as the leader of the Canadian Conservative Party, a well-known champion of this movement. Am I being too forceful on this, or do you think this is right? CANZUK is something that we really need to champion now.
Well, look, I actually think it could be a really effective contributor to global security and to restoration of a liberal world order, as if we can overcome in our own countries, yours included, for want of a better word, critical theory, and this idea that you can actually build societies and a global order on this modern idea of anti-racism, which I find very hard to follow, because it seems that no racist unless you're a white. Now, we ought to all be opposed to racism, but we also ought to recognise that just bandying the term around it, anybody you disagree with, and in effect trying to find a solution to what is a problem of hatred with more hatred, can only come from a place of deep resentment of your own community. So we have to believe in ourselves first as individual nations. And I say that because, Australia is a significant country, Canada is a significant country, but Britain in many ways has been the home of statecraft. It's still a major global economic power. It's wound defence back alarmingly, but you've got craft carrier, a serious one in the water. You still have serious naval capacity and defence capacity.
Yeah.
The sooner Britain can return to a respected place on the global stage, the better. And it grieves me to say that, because I'm implying that it's lost a lot of it. You know, why would Britain want to voluntarily leave the top table of nations? It has so much to offer, and yet it seems as though it's lost in a culture, in a fog of concern about what it now sees as its original sin, its colonial past, and unable to forgive itself, unable to recognise that. I don't think I can put it a better way than this. Britons need Britain, but the world needs Britain at its best, for all of the mistakes that the British might have made down through the ages. Overwhelmingly, they've been an exporter of better governance, of democratic models based on the idea of the rule of law. And boy, do we need that now. No one should be above the law, no one below the law, in our own cultures and as an objective more globally. So we've got to get over our self-loathing first, but the sooner the better.
John, you've spoken a lot about the UK, and I appreciate your words, and I'm sure many Brits will. Right now, Brexit has taken a bit of a backseat because, as we've spoken about, we are dealing with this apparent second wave, but it's still there. And as things stand, the UK will be leaving at the end of the year without a deal. Officially, that's what it looks like. Apparently, the EU delegation are coming to London this week. This is Monday. Michel Barnier, the EU chief negotiator, is coming here. There's been a bit of a war of words going on. Apparently, there are still sticking points over fisheries, sticking points over many other issues as well. As an observer looking from the outside, as an Anglophile, as a supporter of the Commonwealth, what's your assessment now, the second time we've spoken, about how the Brexit negotiations are going, about where things may be at the end of the year and what the future may hold?
Well, my greatest worry is, fortunes wane and wax and wane in politics, but it just seems to be an unfortunate time following COVID, where your Prime Minister, who won a thumping victory, it's not all that long ago, and a very strong endorsement, I think, or a mandate to go and negotiate what the British people have said they wanted on balance. I know there are many people who have a very different perspective, but for the sake of healing British democracy, I think it's very clear that the people's will has to be honoured. And healing that democracy is absolutely first order, I see, priority in the midst of all of these toings and froings over Brexit. And for whatever reason, it seems to me now that your Prime Minister is negotiating from a position of somewhat reduced strength. I can only say that I hope he can recover that very quickly. And my guess is, from afar, that has not a little to do with how COVID unfolds and how it's seen to be handled. And I just ache for the fact that you've got this, call it second spike, call it second wave, whatever it is, at the moment at a personal level. What a terrible thing. And I have family in Britain, and I know how they feel about it and how concerned they are. But on the other hand, I think of my younger relatives in Great Britain, and I think, what is this going to do? Not just to their mental health and employment opportunities and what have you, but to their economic future. This is really chilling stuff. I think of something that Matthew Paris wrote after the great financial crisis that caught my headline. It was reprinted in an Australian newspaper. Face it, we're broke. And what struck me was that there was a refusal to be realistic after the GFC and to say we need to reboot. We've really got to start to wind back this addiction to debt. We've got to do something about it. And my reasoning was that that's right, because there'll be another shock. Well, there's been another shock. We solved the debt crisis with more debt, and now we're going to solve a debt-fueled crisis of the first order with absolutely unimaginable amounts of further debt. It cannot go on much longer. And we don't know whether we'll have a vaccine. So we are going to simply have to fast track ways of learning how to open up our economies again, in my view, or this will doom our successors to a lifetime of deep distrust and cynicism about democratic capitalism. That'll be the price we'll pay if we're not careful.
I also worry, John, about intergenerational conflict coming, especially as younger people are going to pay a huge penalty for this. They're paying the biggest penalty for this.
Yes. And because they've not been taught history, and we know they haven't in any of our cultures, it's either revisionist history or it's no history. They've got very little understanding that in fact it's only democratic capitalism that's lifted people out of poverty, and that it's been a staggering success globally. We've doubled the lifespan of people in the emerging world, in the majority world, largely with Western technology and science and agricultural know-how, driven often by compassion and very noble sentiments. We want to knock ourselves. The last time I said that, I got pummeled. How could I talk of the West that way? But in our part of the world, think of the Green Revolution, which has lifted untold numbers of people out of poverty in Asia and set them on a path to much, much better lives, much more secure and satisfying lives, education for girls and boys, decent lifespans, career opportunities. And a great deal of that was driven out of this little country. A great deal of it, the scientific know-how, the agricultural know-how. So when we're self-examining, and yes, we should be honest about our failings, we need to avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I have two further questions, both centered around Brexit and also your position in Australia. The first is, as things stand, the UK will leave on what are called so-called Australian terms with the EU. I believe this alludes to the current relationship that the EU has with Australia. My first of the final two questions is, to the British people, is this something to fear, leaving the EU on Australian-style terms?
I'd aim a little higher if you could. You're actually talking to a farmer, and the way in which they restrict our access to their markets is still rankles. So I'd aim a little higher if you could. And for the life of me, Europe needs Britain. What's going on here? You need each other. I mean, the idea that you'd cut your nose off to spite your face on trade is just absurd. Fix it in everyone's interest. We know that protectionism, damages everybody. So we're all mature adults. There may be many Europeans who don't want the divorce, but why would they damage their own economies by not looking for a trade deal that worked for everyone? That's a bit simplistic. I know there's a lot more to it than that, but sometimes it helps to go back to basics. We know that trade helps everyone.
I think there's a case, John, that the European Union is concerned that if Brexit is made to look good, then it will encourage more restless, more semi-detached members of the bloc to perhaps think, well, maybe leaving isn't so bad. Perhaps it's a political reason rather than an economic one.
Well, that again goes to the heart, I think, of some of the things that you were alluding to earlier. Their capacity to find real union, is really, I think, somewhat questionable. Look, I mean, I've never been able, Britain stayed out of it wisely, but the common currency, I mean, goodness me, it just locks the people who are really struggling into trouble and turbocharges the economies that are strong. It's an amazing thing here in Australia that there was a time when a German car cost vastly more than the Japanese car. It doesn't anymore. And the reason is the euro.
Absolutely. John, final question. If you had, or perhaps a final message, maybe, you had one message as an Australian, as a former deputy prime minister, as a statesman, if you have one big message for our Prime Minister Boris Johnson vis-a-vis Brexit and the current COVID situation, what would that message be?
Leaders lead, and he needs to, with absolute firmness, with compassion, but without compromise, state his position in the way that I think many British people respected him so much for in the past, and get on with it. I feel loath to offer that because he's a much greater man than I am, but as one who loves Britain and wants to see it sorted out for the sake of Britons, but also for the rest of the world, because it's such an important country with such an important capacity to impart values and ideas and technology and science and so forth to the benefit of the rest of the world, that the sooner it finds its feet again, the better.
I think that's a good, positive message on which to end. So, John Anderson, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for coming back to Brexit Watch. We really appreciate your time today.
Well, as an admirer of so much that's good about Britain and somebody who feels you can learn a lot from such mistakes as they've made, let's start thinking properly about the next generation of people, our children around the world, in our own countries and beyond that. They need us now to be a little less self-indulgent and a lot more, if you like, other person-centred.
John, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.